I would just like to welcome everybody this evening, wherever you might be, and if it's not evening, then still a hearty welcome. This is the third in our series of masterclasses, and just to recap, our masterclass classes are very much aimed at students who are doing business studies to give them exposure to some of the debates and the discussions that are going on in the world of business that are associated with the economy. And we introduce them to practitioners in the field so that we're grappling with real world problems. And this is the third talk that we've had this year. The earlier talks were Rob Hill on game theory and Sharon Brand, who spoke on Industry 4.0. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome Professor Imraan Valodia, who's a long-time colleague and who's spent a lot of time, I know, over his lifetime, in fact, looking at the South African and international economies, and in particular looking at people who are more marginalized in those economies. And the topic tonight is obviously focused on women, and that's obviously appropriate given that we're in August month. And with that, let me hand over to Zezethu Magweba, who is the faculty admin and looks after the students in business studies.
Good evening, everyone. I am Zezethu Magweba, and I am the academic administrator for the faculty, as Jeff mentioned. I'd like to highlight again why we do these sessions. And in simple terms, from what Jeff said, it is to provide prospective students, and our current students more especially, the opportunity to hear from and interact with industry experts in the various pillars of business. So this could be in marketing, economics, operations management, and etc. So it's to just give you the opportunity to listen, hear, and learn from industry experts. This evening's industry expert is Professor Imraan Valodia. Professor Imraan Valodia is a professor of economics and pro-vice chancellor of climate sustainability and inequality, and the director of the Southern Center of Inequality Studies at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. His research interests include inequality, climate justice, competition policy, and the industrial development and employment in developing countries. He has played a leading role in establishing and leading the Wits University's Southern Center for Inequality Studies. He serves on a number of national committees in South Africa, including the Competition Tribunal, the Presidential Economic Advisory Council, and the National Minimum Wage Commission, as well as the Academy of Science of South Africa Standing Committee on Science and the Reduction of Poverty and Inequality. He also serves on the following internationally recognized boards, which is the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development, the United AIDS Global Council on Inequality, AIDS and Pandemics, Women in Informal Employment, Globalizing and Organizing, and the Global Development Institute. I'm sorry for reading a lot. I did not want to make any mistakes. Such a beautiful portfolio here. So without wasting any time, I'd like to hand over to Professor Imraan Valodia to take over today's class. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you so much, Zetu, for those kind introductory thoughts. I should start with a health warning that I had prepared this talk on the basis that I was going to be talking to a group of kind of undergraduate economics and kind of business students. and I'm going to keep the talk at a fairly sort of introductory level, because that's what I had thought my kind of audience, my audience would be. And what I want to do is to kind of introduce you to the field of feminist economics, because it's an area that mostly kind of economics students and business students are not really familiar with, and it's an area that I've found to be extremely kind of useful, because it kind of illuminates for me a part of the economy that I think we often uh, don't see. And I think the fact that we don't see it is a problem. So I'm kind of really just going to introduce you to this field, and we can then kind of in the Q&A session take up the issue. So let me see if I can successfully share my slides. Are you seeing those, Izetu?
Yes. I'm seeing your entire window and not just the slides.
How's that now?
I'm still seeing your entire window with your team's
Oh, because it's
profile.
showing on my side, it's showing as it's in kind of presentation mode. Is that not what you see?
No.
That's a bit odd. Let me try to just fix that quickly.
Okay. While Prof is trying to fix that, he's going to run his lecture, and in the last 20 minutes, we will have a Q&A session for anyone who has any questions, either by unmuting their camera or they can post a question on the chat.
How's that now?
It's showing perfectly, but there is a block of that's showing your team's profile that's like covering half of your presentation. I'm not sure why that pop-up is showing.
Let's see how I'm going to try again.
Does it look good on everyone else's side? Maybe it's an issue on my side.
Is looking good, Zed.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, then it's my side. Sorry about that.
Okay. All right. So what I intend to do then, as I said, is to kind of introduce you to this field of feminist economics. I want to then kind of suggest to you that this more kind of holistic and complete picture of the economy is important. I want to make the argument that it really matters for economic policy that we have this more kind of holistic view of this more holistic view of the economy. And then I want to just share some thoughts on what this might all mean for economic policy in South Africa. So if you were to
Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. In this video, we'll be looking at the circular flow diagram that you learned about at the beginning of your micro
average economics class. You're going to see something.
Let's get into it.
Something of this sort. So I want you to watch the video.
So left completely blank, the circular flow diagram looks like this. There's four things that are happening, and you'll notice that there's a set of arrows that are moving clockwise, and there's a set of arrows that are moving counterclockwise. Now, the important thing to remember in the circular flow diagram is that we are looking at two groups of people. We're looking at firms and households. Firms are producers of goods and services, and households are the suppliers of the factors of production. And so that leads to two markets. The factor market, which is also known as the resource market, this includes the four factors of production, so entrepreneurship, land, labor, and capital. And then we have the product market, which is the products and services that are provided by firms. So in the circular flow diagram, you will notice that there's an arrow going in and out of each market. That is, households give and take from both markets, and so do firms. Now, to help you distinguish between the factor or resource market and the product market, it's important to note who buys and sells which. So the factor market is where households sell the factors of production to firms, and the firms buy the factors of production from households. The product market, on the other hand, is the goods and services or products that firms sell and households buy. Let's look at the top right arrow, the arrow leading into the factor market from households. Well, what factors do households provide for firms? Well, the factors of production, and namely labor and capital, but this also includes land and entrepreneurship. This is supplied to firms from households. And so on the other side, what do firms receive from the factor market? Well, obviously the labor and capital being supplied by households. But what about the arrow going the other direction? What do firms have to give to the factor market? Well, they have to pay for their cost of labor and capital, or the cost of the factors of production. And how do households receive these payments? Well, in the form of wages and rents. So you'll notice that households are essentially selling labor and capital and receiving back wages and rents for this. And firms are buying labor and capital and then therefore paying the costs of said labor and capital. But what about the product market? Well, firms give goods and services through the product market. Again, goods are being sold by the firms, and therefore the households will be receiving those same goods and services. But what about the green arrow? How does that fit in? Well, what do households give in exchange for their goods and services? Well, their expenditure or consumption expenditure, meaning they're spending on goods and services. And how does this relate to what firms take in? Well, they take in revenues for all of the goods and services that are sold. So again, this circular flow diagram, you could look at the green arrow as the movement of money amongst these markets, and you could look at the pink arrow as the movement of what is being bought or sold. Now, this does get a little bit more intricate as you move on. You start to look at the foreign market, governments, and banks, but we'll be making a video on the circular flow of income a little bit later on, so be on the lookout for that video if it's something you're interested in. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. In this video...
Okay, so what that video does is to present something that I think is kind of really influential in the field of economics. It presents a kind of a model of the economy that has kind of households on the one side and firms on the other side, and kind of really kind of describes how kind of households and firms interact, and that model, while I've kind of shown you a kind of a really simple really simple depiction of it, is something that is really at the is kind of really something that is hugely influential in the field of economics. And if you've done an economics 101 class, you would have come across that sort of circular flow of how the economic system works. And what's kind of really important there is it's sort of trying to sort of capture in a simple way what the key interactions are kind of in an economic system. So I'd like you to then contrast that model of the economy with a model of the economy that is now on your screen. And what this model is kind of work that was done by a kind of really famous feminist economist, Diane Nelson, and she tried to capture from a feminist point of view, or as the the picture says from the eyes of women, what are the key kind of interactions in an economic system? And I want to draw a few things to your attention in this diagram. The first is that she's got four kind of sectors of the economy. So there's the domestic sector, which is broadly equivalent to what was the households in the earlier depiction. She has the NGO sector, where you would have paid work and voluntary work happening. There's the formal paid sector in the private sector at the top of the graphic. But what's interesting about her graphic here is that she draws a distinction in the private sector between formal paid work and kind of informal unpaid sort of self-employment, which we would think of as the informal economy. What's key to the graphic here is the bottom part of it. So what kind of in the earlier model is the household sector. Here, what kind of Elson depicts is the importance of unpaid care work that is done in an economic system, which was not at all reflected in the earlier model. So what's key here in this is that there's a whole lot of unpaid care work that happens in the domestic sector, which is absolutely critical if you see the two people on the right-hand side for how our economic system operates. So that unpaid care work is really, really critical for the supply of labor, both to the formal kind of private sector paid and kind of informal work. It's absolutely critical to paid work in the public sector, and it supplies paid work to the NGO sector. But what's absolutely key to the way that the whole system operates is the unpaid work that is done. If you concentrate on the blue on the parts that are in blue, and I'm just highlighting the kind of blue part. That's the kind of areas of the economy that you see in the earlier model that I showed. The gray and the kind of shaded bits that are blue and gray are things that we don't that we don't traditionally see in models of the economy. Well, what I think this means is that when we think about economic systems, we often don't take a view on what is really, really important to the way this whole system operates, and that's unpaid reproductive care work that we do, and where there's a particular distribution of how that care work happens. I'm going to show you some information in a short while, which will give you some sense of who does that work, and kind of how it's distributed in our society. So my sort of point really is that it's important for us to think to kind of think about the parts of our economic system that we see traditionally, and the parts of our economic system that our traditional models don't show us. I find this really, really interesting because it it now gives me a sense of the economy that is a lot more complete than the one that you had from the earlier model. What is quite key in the kind of in the field of economics, in kind of how we think about this household sector, is two views that are really influential in the field, and both Gary Becker and kind of Amartya Sen, both are kind of economists who won Nobel Prizes for the work that they did in trying to understand the household from kind of from an economic perspective. In the earlier one, and this is the Becker model, and this is consistent with the first model of the economy that I showed. We think about the household as a kind of as a family unit, where all members of that household tend to work together to kind of advance the kind of interests of members of that household. What kind of Amartya Sen's model of that household kind of really kind of illuminates for us is a model where there's kind of bargaining inside the household, and he's characterized that as a model of the household where there's cooperative conflict. What's really important about that is that at the center of how we should think about this is the issue of power in the household, and certain members of the household, men in general, have power and are able to exert a large amount of influence over how that household operates, who does the paid work, who does the unpaid work, and how that household's going to fit into the economic system. So if I can then just summarize the points that I've made about the households and the earlier model that I shared, which kind of gave you a more gendered view of how our economic system operates. So it's this model here. What are the key ways in which this model differs from the earlier one? What's key in this model is an understanding of 5 things. One is that within our economic system, there are kind of relationships of patriarchy, where in general men are able to exert a much more important kind of influence on how these economic systems operate. 2, and I'll go back to the what is key about this unpaid care work that kind of happens in our society is that kind of absolutely key to how the economy operates is the reproduction of workers. So the earlier model that I shared with you sees the household as kind of essentially selling its labor and buying some goods. Kind of how the labor is produced, and who's producing the labor, and who's doing all of the work to make sure that the labor is employable, is really not something that that's in that model. 3 is that there's a gendered division of labor that kind of operates in kind of all kind of economic systems. So when kind of Sen, or when kind of Elson draws out the difference between the formal sector and the informal sector, essentially what she's doing is kind of highlighting the facts, the fact that there's some sectors of the economy that employ men, and there's some sectors of the economy that are largely kind of areas that women work in. And if we look at the international data on informal employment, you'll find that the bulk of the workers in that sector are women. It tends to be a sector where kind of incomes are quite low, where kind of regulations to protect workers tend not to exist, kind of et cetera, et cetera. Point 5, and I hope you would have seen this in the kind of in the Elson model, is the kind of importance of care in how our economic system operates, but also the fact that whole care part of our economic system is not something that you would have seen in the first model that I shared with you. So for me, the five characteristics of this feminist economics area that I think are quite important are the 5 that are on your screen now, and the 5 that I've discussed. So let's think then about what are the data that can tell us something about how care systems operate, and who does all of this reproductive who does all of the work that is kind of involved in the reproduction of workers, which we tend not to see in the GDP, which we tend not to see in that first model that I shared with you. So the one way in which we can get some sense of this is to use information from time use surveys. So what time use surveys do is that they kind of select a representative sample of kind of people in a country, and then they kind of record how people use their time. We're kind of in the fortunate position in South Africa that we do have a time use survey. These are kind of surveys that are now kind of growing in importance, but it's not something that you'd find across the world. So what sense can we make of kind of how men and women use their time differently? What this kind of graphic does is to give you a sense of the average, and we're using the mean, the minutes per day spent by all respondents who responded to the time use survey. So these would be broad averages. It would include people who might have children, people who might not, etc. But here's the broad trend. So we spend kind of in terms of males and kind of females about the same amount of time for what is classified as personal care. Personal care would kind of include things like sleeping, taking care of yourself, etc. So there's not big differences in terms of gender there. The key differences you'll see in the slide are the amount of time that we spend on household maintenance, the amount of time that we spend caring for kind of other people. So this isn't care for ourselves, care of someone else. And you can see a kind of substantial difference in the amount of time that men spend on kind of household maintenance. You can see that kind of on average, women spend more than twice the amount of time that men do. Kind of in terms of the care for others, you can see that kind of on average, kind of females spend 6 times as much time sort of caring for others. So when we think about this part of the economy that we often don't see in our models and which I've highlighted to you, you can see that there's a clear gendered distribution to kind of how that work that we do is distributed kind of among members of our society. So why does all of this matter, and why should we be concerned kind of about these issues? So there's many reasons. I want to highlight 2 here. The first is, if you think about inequality in South Africa, I think I'm kind of hoping that you would accept that this kind of care economy, the fact that we don't see it traditionally, etc., might be one of the key reasons why South Africa has kind of as much inequality that we do. It's kind of certainly the key thing driving inequality in terms of gender. But I want to suggest to you that there might be a much more important kind of issue that we often don't see. So let's take a scenario where kind of someone in National Treasury is kind of having to decide between expenditure that could either go to kind of supporting firms in the private sector, or else to public expenditure for children or for people that are aged. Most of the economic models that would sit in kind of places kind of such as National Treasury wouldn't have any data on kind of all of this care work that we do, and would have no data on the gendered distributions of that care work. If that official was making proposals to the minister on where that money should should be allocated, I think you would accept that that because they're not seeing that part of the economy, those resources are going to be allocated kind of in a place which is not the most optimal kind of place for it to be allocated. So the fact that this part of the economy isn't in our data, isn't in our view of the economy, that leads to kind of allocation of resources that are not in the interest of everyone in society, and it's not an optimal allocation of resources, which many in the kind of in the field of economics would argue you have to allocate those resources optimally, because they're not in the data. It means you're not allocating the resources optimally. Let me then draw out some thoughts on why I think all of these issues might be important for the South African policy questions that we discuss every day. I think if you accept that model that kind of Elson provides, I think it gives you some clue in the employment debate to the gendered patterns of employment in South Africa, and gives you a view to why it might be that kind of in kind of employment in South Africa, that females are much more likely to be unemployed, why they're much more likely to be doing an excessive amount of work in the care sector, and why they spend a disproportionate amount of their time doing kind of unpaid care work, which is kind of essentially kind of work that should be distributed in a much more equitable way in our society. We have policies that have been trying to deal with these issues, and I think our Employment Equity Act is one attempt to try to change these patterns of employment. But the problem with kind of acts like that is they only benefit women kind of generally at the higher ends of the income distribution, and kind of females who are highly skilled. These sorts of instruments don't really impact much on the kind of bottom end of the income distribution. And I think this might also give us some clues to why South Africa's informal economy tends to be so underdeveloped, and these relationships of power in that sector, I think, are also important issues for us to think about. It might also give us some clues for why it is that the owners of capital in South Africa tend largely to be men, and that notwithstanding all of the attempts to fix this, that females are largely absent as kind of owners of firms and kind of enterprises. I think really the key kind of issue is kind of the way our economic systems kind of interact with patriarchy, both inside the household, but also much more broadly in our society. So what might be some sort of proposals for how we can how we can change these patterns. I think there's three kind of suggestions that I would make. Firstly, that we should have much better social policy in South Africa to change the kind of patterns with which this unpaid care work is distributed. I think rather than cutting expenditure in kind of important areas such as health, kind of such as childcare, which we have been doing, we should be increasing expenditure in kind of in these areas, because that work in kind of in caring still has to be done. It just gets done by kind of in an unpaid way when the state withdraws resources. And I think we need better sort of policies to promote informal work, which would then kind of create which would then create a lot more opportunities for opportunities for kind of females to build up capital and to have a larger stake in our kind of in our economic system. So for my last slide, I just want to add two things that are perhaps going to, that are the big issues that are going to face us in the next while, and share with you some thoughts on why some of the feminist economics arguments might be important. So the first really is kind of climate change. My sense of climate change is that we're going to see huge disruptions in our society that is going to massively increase the kind of amount of care that we have to do in our society. So when you have floods, when you have kind of agriculture failing, when you have energy systems failing, etc., this burden of care increases, and you've seen what the distribution of kind of that work is, and the fact that large amounts of it is done on an unpaid basis. The second big thing that we likely to face is kind of artificial intelligence, and what then might be some of the implications for kind of women's work. I think 3 points here. One is, if you look at the way AI operates, it's largely based on kind of on machines having to learn from kind of existing knowledge systems. And all of the kind of early evidence that we have on this is that all of these kind of gender biases in kind of how we think about economics is being transplanted kind of into the AI space. Point two is that that the fields that are developing this kind of AI in science and kind of technology, what we refer to as the STEM areas, is an area where there's a massive underrepresentation of women. And thirdly, kind of, I think we're still not clear on what the likely kind of employment kind of impacts might be in terms of gender. But my kind of reading of the early evidence is that it's likely to have disproportionately negative impacts on kind of employment of women. So I'll stop there. I hope you found that of kind of some kind of some interest, and kind of happy to take any questions. So back to you, Zezethu.
Thank you very much, Prof. Thank you very much for that. We do have one question here on the chat. It's asking, do time-use data charts on care work look different for different countries? For example, Sweden, India, etc.
And so, Jeff, so from the data that we have, the kind of inequalities in terms of gender tend to be kind of to be found across the board, but in kind of in developing countries where public provision of kind of services tends to be a lot less than it is in developed countries, both the kind of amount of time that is spent and kind of and also the distribution of it tends to be slightly different. So more time is spent on unpaid unpaid care work, and the distribution of it tends to be a lot more towards women.
Okay, thank you very much, Prof. Anyone else with a question, you can write it on chat or you can unmute your microphone and ask. I do see there are a few people typing, Prof, so I'll just wait for that.
Okay. I see there's another question from Jeff as well.
Yes. Jeff is asking, would your policy prescription for South Africa be for government to put a lot more resource into support early childhood development?
Yeah, I think so the kind of general point that I would make is more public sector expenditure is likely to have a huge kind of impact on the amount of this care work that we have to do unpaid, and on the distribution of it. So policies like ECD, etc., have large impacts. They kind of also sort of change the distribution kind of inside our society on kind of how this happens, and the more publicly provided facilities we have, the more the better the distribution of this work.
Okay, thank you so much. Sharon wants to know, how can social welfare programs be redesigned to include gender awareness?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I can kind of immediately answer the question, Sharon. My thoughts are, so I'm not a kind of a social policy expert, but kind of I would think that there's two parts to it. The one is that we need to kind of better design them so that we deal with the kind of power relationships inside households. And two, I think policies also need to be driven towards trying to change the behavior of men. So if you contrast if you contrast our policies with kind of Sweden's, kind of in as far as we deal with leave for kind of childbirth. So Sweden has a kind of interesting policy where the first part of the first part of maternity leave is kind of exclusively for females, because the kind of birth process kind of only happens kind of on one side of the gender divide. But there's policies there that kind of allow the household to distribute that leave between different members of the household that would provide the care. And I think policies like that are quite interesting, and something that perhaps we can innovate on.
Yeah, thank you so much. We also have another question from Solomon. He's asking, to what extent do South Africa's higher education systems prepare women to enter the labor market, and how do these systems address specific challenges faced by women in balancing labor and social reproduction?
So kind of an interesting question, Solomon. I'm not sure that I have a kind of specific kind of answer, but here's a thought, right? So if I look at the data on the numbers of students at kind of universities such as the one I teach in, our distribution at WITS of male and females is about 50-50. So I think in terms of kind of access, that the kind of higher education system, kind of, at least in the data that I see, tends to be equitable. But if I look at kind of at the distribution of who does science, who does economics, who does the business areas, and who does the care areas like kind of social work, etc., I think I'll find that there's a gendered distribution there. And I think in that way, the higher education system is not doing such a fantastic job. And then if we look at the kind of employment data and compare it to the access data in universities, kind of I think that the let's take the paid data. Men are kind of really much more at the top end of the pay scales, and women tend not to be as well represented there. So kind of, again, I think the higher education system's not kind of dealing sufficiently with that problem, kind of, at least in as far as the higher education system interacts with the labor market.
Thank you very much, Prof. Is there anyone else in the class with a question? I'm just going to give an extra few seconds to see if anyone's typing. Okay, no one's typing. Jeff, do you have any last words?
Thanks, Lizette. I'm just in closing. I would really like to thank Professor Valodia for a really sort of stimulating talk, and I think it does call into question a whole lot of things that I think we often sort of take for granted when we're looking at economic data and we're looking at policy making. And I think this does lift the lid on a really, really important part of the economy, which doesn't get spoken about nearly enough. So thank you very much, Prof. Valodia, for that input. And thank you very much, Zazette, for chairing tonight. And thank you, everybody who joined on the call. I hope you found it as stimulating as I did. It was really great. Thank you very much indeed. And is there anything in parting, Prof. Valodia, that you would like to say, or
just thanks. Thank you for the opportunity. Kind of, and if anyone's kind of interested in this area, feel free to kind of drop me an email. You'll find my email on the internet. I'm happy to share with you some readings and some kind of some work that you might that you might be interested to read.
Thank you very much, Prof. Before we end, I see that I have a few people typing, so I'm not too sure if they're asking questions. Okay, it's just a few thank yous. Thank you very much, Prof, once again, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening, and have a lovely evening further.
Thank you so much, Zezetu, and good evening to everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
bye? Thank you.